Chapter 20. Pygmalion. Almost every year there was a graduation from high school, a graduation from college, and a wedding. By the middle 1930s, all of us through Lillian were married and had homes of our own. Most of the married ones had children. Fred and Dan were in college, Jack and Bob were in high school, and Jane was about to enter the 10th grade. The first year of high school under the system, then standard in Montclair. There was a new deal in the country and a new deal at our house, where Jack was in charge when Mother was away. The new deal was at home was brought about principally by Tom's absence. He was in a hospital, suffering from a heart ailment, and the warmth and excitement had evaporated from the kitchen. All rules about feeding and playing with 16, his current cat, and about keeping out of the kitchen, except on Tom's special invitation, had been suspended. An energetic colored woman now did the cooking, and much of the housework and dishes as Mother would allow. Mother always had been convinced that anyone who worked for her was terribly imposed upon, so much so that sometimes it was difficult to tell who was working for whom. As a result, it was a race between Mother and the energetic maid to see who could make the beds first, and sweep the upstairs in the mornings. Since both were early risers, the race often ended at dead heat, with Mother handling one side and the maid the other, of a bed that was still warm. "You have enough to do without making the beds," Mother would say when the maid urged her to sit down and relax a few minutes. "This leaning over is just what I need. I like to get a little exercise before I leave for the city." At supper time, Mother would whisk away a dish as soon as one of the children had taken his last mouthful, and carry it out to the butler's pantry to wash and dry it, while the maid was still finishing her meal in the kitchen. When the child would go to put his fork down, there wouldn't be any place to put it except the tablecloth, so he'd have to hold it in his hand until Mother came back. "The maid may want to go to a movie or something," Mother would explain, while she collected the silverware. Between the colored woman and Mother, the children were relieved of all the chores that the rest of us had to do in the past. Now that there was no young children in the house, there was no need for the system under which each child was responsible for a younger one, or for the process charts in the bathrooms. The German and French language records had worn out or been broken, and Mother had never replaced them. When the married members of the family dropped in to visit, they did not hesitate to tell Mother that they had never had things that easy when they were growing up, and that the three youngest were being spoiled. But Mother, bouncing a grandchild on her knee and playing peekaboo, would reply that she wasn't sure this little fellow was being raised just right either. He had on too many clothes, for one thing, and she didn't think she liked his color. Those new formulas might be all right, but... We knew it was an act, because Mother herself always laughed at meddling grandmothers, and she really believed the new formulas were resulting in bigger, stronger babies. But she managed to get across her point. We began to suspect, while watching how Mother was raising her three youngest, that she had never entirely approved of many of Dad's systems of regimentation. Some of them had been necessary because the family was so large. Perhaps she had allowed the others to remain in effect until they stopped of their own accord, because she didn't want to overrule Dad. Mother seemed, if possible, to grow closer than ever to her three youngest children. But we thought the house must seem empty of children to her. She was bound to realize that Jane would be away at college in a little more than 3 years, and that after that there would be no one left at home. We wondered what she would do in the big, drafty house that held so many memories. She couldn't stay there by herself, of course. Yet we felt sure she'd never be willing to sell it. And she had said repeatedly she wouldn't live in anyone else's home, even the home of one of her children. Frankly, we were worried about Mother. The 4 youngest boys wanted to be sure Jane would be a social success when she entered high school. The last of the Gilbreths, they thought they should set a record for popularity that would stand at least until the grandchildren came along. The Bobby Sock era was making its debut after a decade of formal afternoon dresses, spiked heels, and kinky permanent waves. The Hepcat and the Square were about to take their place at opposite ends of the Tarascoran scale, and it was possible to cut a rug without having either carpet or scissors. The boys wanted to be sure that Jane was among the first on the bandwagon. In many respects, Jane was Martha all over. She was tall for her age, didn't realize she had developed a figure, and was content to wear Lillian's hand-me-down dresses and shoes. Also, she had a habit of flopping untidily into chairs, and spreading her knees as wide as a chestnut tree. But she was beginning to be interested in boys, and she listened willingly to the suggestions of Fred, Dan, Jack, and Bob. Fred and Dan, who were college men, spoke with some authority, were the first to start grooming Jane for high school. During the summer, they began to tell her what sort of clothes she should buy for her fall wardrobe. "Those things you wear are all out of date," Fred said. "Only sad apples wear them anymore. You want to get saddle shoes, sweaters, skirts, and socks that just come to your ankle." "I'm not going to dress like a little girl," Jane complained. "I can dress up more than that when I go to high school, can't I, Mother?" "Well, the boys usually know what they're talking about," Mother said doubtfully. "Lillian has a silk dress she said I can have, and I thought I'd get some others like that," Jane pouted. "You listen to what we're telling you," Jane ordered. "Those silk dresses are out. The college girls are wearing what Fred says, and you want to be one of the first in high school to dress that way." "The first impression you make in high school decides whether you're popular," Jack agreed. "The boys from the upper classes come down by the front door and give the new girls a once-over." Jane was also to let her blonde hair grow and to fix it in a page boy. She was to stop the business of flopping into chairs as if she were playing a game of statue, and she wasn't to use any makeup except lipstick. Fred studied her face critically. "Dark red lipstick," he said. "That's the right color for you. Right, Dan?" "Dark red," Dan agreed. "Not too much of it." "But Mother said I could wear all the makeup I wanted when I got to high school," said Jane. "I don't know about all this little girl stuff. Did Mother put you boys up to this?" "I didn't have a thing to do with it," Mother promised. "I don't approve of makeup, but everyone I've seen in high school paints like an Indian. And if that's the way you want to look, it's your face. See if I care." "What everyone else does in high school is old stuff," Fred explained. "That's what we're trying to tell you. Do you want to be a sad apple?" Jane said she guessed if she had to be any sort of apple, she'd rather not be a sad one. Dan then showed her how she should sit down. He walked mincingly, with an assumed nonchalance, to a chair, turned around with a swing of his hips, rose on his tiptoes and sat down daintily with his knees together, and flounced as he adjusted an imaginary skirt. "It's the kind of jump you give at the end that gets them," he explained. You act and dress casually, as if you didn't know men existed, but really, you're on the ball all the time. And the little things like that jump at the end emphasize all of a girl's best assets." Jane tried it, but the boys were far from satisfied. She tried it again with no more success. "Don't jump like someone left a hat pin in the chair," Dan winced. "I'll swear, I believe you're hopeless. Don't you know how to do a feminine flounce?" "I did just like you," said Jane, beginning to lose patience. "You jumped like something was in the chair too, didn't he, Mother?" Mother, sitting in a corner, pretended she was absorbed in a book and didn't answer. "I'm not supposed to know exactly how to do it," Dan shouted. "All I could do is give you the general idea. For Lord's sake, don't girls have any natural instinct about how to do things like that?" "If they do," Jane said haughtily, "it's the first time I've heard about it, and I'm not going to listen if you holler at me, and I'm not going to dress that way either." She stalked across the room, picked up a magazine, sat down by Mother, and, there was no doubt about it, flounced as she angrily adjusted her skirts. "That's it, Jane," Fred shouted, "just like that." "Just like what?" Jane sulked. "You give me a pain in the neck, all of you." "What did you do just then," said Fred, "when you fixed your skirts?" "I didn't do anything," said Jane, "except this." And she flounced again. "Solid," Dan agreed. "Well, why didn't you say so? Anybody knows how to do this." She flounced the third time. "The way Dan showed me, you'd need a built-in pogo stick. I thought you were supposed to see light between me and the chair." Somewhat pleased with herself, she rejoined the boys for further instructions. Jane already knew most of the new dance steps, so her brothers weren't worried about that, but they spent a good deal of time teaching her dance floor behavior. The boys thought that the most important formula for popularity in dance was knowing how to act when someone cut in. They said they had seen many a girl who was good-looking and a beautiful dancer, but who was stuck most of the night because she gave the impression she didn't like to be broken. "It boils down to this, and I'll admit it's an art," said Dan. "You've got to make sure the boy you're dancing with thinks you're sorry that someone is cutting in, and you've got to make the boy who's cutting in think you're glad." Jane said that sounded insincere to her, and she believed a girl should always be sincere, didn't Mother? Mother thought that was a safe enough one. "Yes, indeed, dear." she said, coming up from behind her book. It's a mistake to be hypocritical. Of course you should be sincere, Fred agreed. But you can be glad and sorry at the same time, can't you? Like when you graduated from junior high? Sorry to leave these infants, Jane laughed condescendingly. I was glad then, but I guess I see what you mean. Sure you do, Fred soothed her. You're a smart chick. Okay, Jane surrendered. How do you do it, then? Fred and Dan, both 6 feet tall and none too graceful, started to dance, and Jack and Bob, not far from 6 feet and even less graceful, prepared to take turns cutting in. Mother now gave up all pretense of reading. Her book lay face down on her lap. She had the "what's this generation coming to" look on her face, and she seemed tense, as if ready to make a game at catching vases and lamps, in case the boy should bump into them. Now I'm leading, Fred told Jane, and it's up to the girls to make small talk, about anything at all. The only small talk I'd make if you were my partner, said Dan, is to warn you that if you don't put your right hand up higher, I'll leave you in the middle of the dance floor. You wolf, you. Jack stepped up and tapped Fred on the shoulder. Remember, Jane, I'm playing your part, Dan explained. Up till now, you've been following your partner. Now you lead just enough so you swing him around and your back's to the boy who cut in. Dan swung Fred around. Only, it's not absolutely necessary to kick him like that when you swing him, said Fred, rubbing his shins. Now, Dan continued, see, my back's toward Jack. He can't see what I'm doing. So I look at Fred and I frown a little. I'm disappointed our dance has to end. He wrinkled his forehead and his nose and made a hideous moue at Fred. See, Dan said, asking Jane. Now I hate to see him go, and he's pretty sure to come back and dance with me again. The hell I would, said Fred. After the last look, I believe I'd run to the locker room and see if anyone had a drink. Then, Dan ignored him, you separate from your partner, but you still hold his hand. Just before you let it go, you give it an intimate little squeeze like this. Dan and Fred both squeezed with all their might. They were always testing their grips, Indian wrestling and putting their elbows side by side on a table to see which one could make the other bend his arm. The handshake ended in a tie and they let go. Now, you turn around, said Dan, somewhat red of face but still intent on his instructions. Your back's toward your old partner. Now you face your new partner and your eyes light up. You've been rescued. You've been looking forward all night to this particular dance. You glide into your new partner's arms. He stumbled into Jack's, and you say, Oh, no you don't, Mother interrupted, as she was so intent her book dropped to the floor. You've got to be careful to dance away a few steps from your old partner first. You don't want him to hear you, do you? Dan let go of Jack, and all of them turned with new interest to Mother. How'd you know that? Fred said. You're completely right, but why? They didn't even cut in at dances when you were a girl. They didn't cut in, said Mother, but they came up to your chair where you were sitting with your old partner. I always danced a few steps away from the chair, and then I said, Who's being hypocritical now? Fred hooted. What was it that you said, Mother? Jane giggled. Nothing, I guess, Mother said primly, leaning over to retrieve her book. Nothing that would interest this generation. Come on, tell us, Jane insisted. Well, Mother blushed. When it was your father, I guess I said something like, Why, Mr. Gilbreth, imagine finding you here. Where have you been keeping yourself all evening? Was that before or after you were married? Jane asked. Oh, both, said Mother, now apparently intent on her reading again. And where had he been keeping himself? Said Jane, refusing to let the subject drop. What's that, dear? Mother asked, as if she had not been paying attention. Where had he been? Your father? Not very far away, dear, Mother smiled. Not down in the locker room. Jane's debut at a high school was a success, and Jack and Bob informed her she had passed the opening day scrutiny. Besides Jane, only a handful of seniors had worn bobby sock clothes, but the handful was composed of girls who admittedly set the fashions, and there was no doubt that the new style would take hold. Fred and Dan returned to Brown and Pennsylvania respectively, and Jack and Bob continued the grooming of their younger sister. She was to be friendly with everybody, including sad apples and teachers. She was to learn the names of everyone in her class, and to speak to them by name when she passed them in the hall. She was to be a good student without giving the impression of studying too much, and she was to keep her face, hands, and nails clean, even if it meant going to the girls' room between classes. "There's nothing worse than a dingy-looking girl," Jack told her. "So don't think I'm minding your business if I see you in school and tell you to wash yourself. I'll just whisper it." "How about dingy boys?" Jane protested. Why, Bob and I always look like we just stepped out of a bandbox," Jack smirked. "I don't know about that," said Jane. "But if you did, you must have been playing the drums." "Nobody notices how boys look," said Jack, cuffing her fondly. "And nobody cares whether boys are popular in school." Sometimes Jane thought it was more trouble than it was worth, especially when the two boys said she might begin to put on weight and started taking her desserts away from her. But she had to admit they were right about the clothes, and she suspected they knew what they were talking about on other things too. She started having movie dates at night on weekends. Mother didn't disapprove, and Jack and Bob were elated. The boys wanted to make sure, though, that no one got the wrong idea about what sort of girl she was, so they always told her just what time she had to be home. Usually, to make sure there was no misunderstanding, they told her date, too. When the dates saw the size of her older brothers and were informed they'd be waiting up for Jane, there was little to no argument. "Even Cinderella could stay out till midnight," Jane would complain to Mother. "Jack and Bob make my dates bring me home by 10:30. "Aw, your father wouldn't let Anne go out at all at night, unless he went along as a chaperone," Mother comforted her. "You don't know how lucky you are to have such liberal-minded men in the family." "Good night, that was a generation ago. Times have changed." The first dance of the school year was a junior-senior alumni affair, held during the Thanksgiving holidays. It was unusual for girls in the 10th grade to be invited. In fact, none of our girls had ever been asked until they had been juniors. But Jane's special popularity course had brought results. She had invitations from a junior and 2 seniors. The boys told her to accept the junior, since he had asked her first. The word always got around, they said, if you turned down an early invitation to accept a later one. Fred and Dan were home for the holidays, and they and the younger boys agreed to go stag to the party, to make sure that Jane wasn't stuck on the dance floor. Each of the boys also enlisted the aid of 4 or 5 friends, all of whom seemed willing, even eager to cooperate. Right from the start, Jane was broken more than any other girl. Her hand squeezes as she left one partner and her pleased smile as she started off with the other apparently became important factors as the night wore on, because even without her click, she was undeniably getting a rush. Then Dan cut in and found Jane near tears. "He kissed me," she whispered indignantly. "I slapped him as hard as I could, and he just laughed and kissed me again." Dan roughly shoved away 2 boys who were trying to cut in. "Beat it," he growled. "She doesn't want to dance with you." "They weren't the ones," Jane whispered as the boys retreated. "I don't care," said Dan. "You're not going to dance with anybody till we teach you some more." He signaled Fred, Jack, and Bob and guided Jane out onto the porch. "Who did it?" Dan asked. "I'm going to show him which sister to make a pass at." "A boy named Ned Morris," Jane told him. "He's a senior. I hope you fix him good." Fred, Jack, and Bob joined them on the porch, and Dan explained the situation. "He's in my class, so I get to whip him, right?" Dan and Bob said she was right, but Fred disagreed. "We spent a whole summer teaching her how to be popular," he warned, "and now you want to undo it all. Nobody will take her out if they think you have to end up fighting us, in case he gets romantic. And besides, it's really our fault," Bob conceded dramatically. "We taught her how to be attractive, but we didn't teach her how to turn it off." "I slapped him good," Jane said. "I thought that would turn it off." "Worst thing you could do," said Fred, shaking his head. "It's our fault, all right. We'll keep a close eye on things for the rest of the night, and don't let anybody else take you off the dance floor." Mother was asleep when Jane and the boys returned home from the dance, but she heard them and came down in her bathrobe to help them raid the icebox. Jane wasn't upset anymore, and she told Mother with considerable detail about all the rush she had. "You're lucky to have so many brothers to help you get started," Mother said, looking proudly at the boys. "You boys have been mighty sweet to her." "I'll say," Jane agreed excitedly. "And what do you think, Mother? Tonight they're going to teach me about kissing." "I think that's fine," said Mother. "And it's not every girl there—" "What? They're going to teach you about what?" she shouted. "About kissing," said Jane. "I won't have it," Mother announced flatly. "I try to be modern. I don't say a word when they were showing you about hand squeezes and things like that. Things most girls don't know till they're in their 20s. She raised her voice again. "I won't have any lessons on that. The very idea." It took a little explaining to get across the notion that the boys were planning to teach Jane how not to be kissed. And after Mother had heard what happened at the dance, she agreed that instructions weren't taking place a minute too soon. She poured herself a glass of milk while Fred fixed a peanut butter sandwich, and she got plates and cut apple cake for everyone. Then, after looking around self-consciously as if she was not sure but what Tom would return unexpectedly from the hospital, she perched on his table. "School's in session," she declared. The boys asked Jane how and where it happened. "We were dancing, and he asked me how I'd like to go out on the porch and look at the moon," she said. "I squeezed his hand like you showed me and said I wouldn't mind." "No wonder you got kissed, you sap," Dan moaned. "What'd you do that for?" "You told me," Jane replied angrily. "Don't try to blame me. You said I should try to make all of them like me. How was I supposed to know he didn't want to look at the moon?" "Jane's right," Mother agreed. "It's not her fault." The boys told her that from now on Jane was supposed to shun parked cars and porches, and was to view with suspicion any conversation about planets, satellites, constellations, or the need for a breath of fresh air. They showed her, too, how to sit far over on her own side of the car, coming home from a date, and how to lean forward or twist so her back was to the door, if anyone tried to put his arm around her shoulder. "Now, if a boy kisses you anyway," said Jack, "the best squelch you can give him is a little to act like a dummy. The kiss does not affect with you one way or the other. You're bored with the whole business." "That usually gives them the idea," Bob agreed. "If it doesn't, you can wipe your lips with the back of your hand and look as if there's something that the best friend ought to tell you that's there." "Never slap them," said Fred. "A slap just makes them mad, and they still don't know whether you really object to being kissed or whether you're playing hard to get." "You boys," said Mother disapprovingly, "seem to know a great deal about it. Where'd you find out about things like this?" "It's information," Fred grinned, "that's handed down from father to son." Tom died a few months later, convinced that Plorzy was the old enemy that finally laid him low. While he was at the hospital, some of us went to see him almost every day. Sometimes he'd beg to be taken home, where he felt sure he could cure himself in a few days with his quinine remedy, but the doctors wouldn't allow him to be moved. On several occasions we smuggled bottles of the remedy into the hospital, hoping that his faith in its curative powers might make him well again. It didn't seem to affect him one way or another. Tom had always been suspicious of hospitals. He had often told us his belief that doctors sometimes give the black bottle, poison, to patients who didn't have plenty of money. Toward the end, when he recognized us less frequently, he refused to take any medicine, even the remedy. It could be said that Tom was a man who never amounted to much. By some standards, perhaps he wasn't even a very good man. He swore a good deal, and in later years he drank more than he should have. But the day he died, 12 people wept for him, and that number may be more than par for the course.